So for those of you who just rolled in, thank you very much for joining us on this great topic of education. We've been rolling out some of these ongoing conversations on the topic of economic recovery readiness and what that means to, how are we going to come out of this ready and mobilized as a community? How are we going to work together to, address some very large, very glaring issues that were always there in the past, but have become quite prominent and bubbled up to the surface. We do have a fantastic panel here to discuss the topic of education, and I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you very much. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. So we will start with Bryan.
Oh, Ari, Bryan Bellefeuille, Deshta Cause, Nipissing and Blind River Donta. So my name is Bryan Bellefeuille. I'm from Nipissing First Nation, born and raised, and I'm currently residing in Blind River. I am a teacher. I am a father of two, soon to be three, very exciting, but not too soon. I have enough time for this call, and I'm very excited to have another child coming into my life, and a firekeeper and a grass dancer in my community. And I'm here to speak a little bit from the lens of all of those roles. So begrudge for taking your time to listen to me.
Perfect, thank you very much. Dr. Ferguson?
Hi, my name is Kristen Ferguson. I'm an associate professor of education at Nipissing University. It's a real pleasure to be on the call tonight. I'm a professor of education of pre-service literacy education, so teaching those in the BEd program the skills of language, arts, and literacy. I'm also a teacher. I used to teach in the Tri-Town area and the Kirkland Lake area. And I'm also a parent of 3 school-age children doing all the Learn at Home programs like many other people probably on this call tonight.
Thank you. Marit?
Well, I'm Marit Stiles. I'm the member of Provincial Parliament for Davenport, which is a riding in downtown West End, Toronto. I'm originally from Newfoundland, and I'm the education critic for the official opposition in Ontario. I'm thrilled to be here. I should also say I used to be a school board trustee for a while before I became an MPP. So that's kind of my grounding in education. But I'm a parent too, and I have 2 daughters. One just started university and unfortunately had to come back early, and the other is in high school. And so I'm also, like many of folks out there, working with her to help her stay focused and try to learn in whatever way that can happen, and juggling all that. So I'm really excited to be here, though. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. So my name is Erika Lougheed. I wear many hats, but the hat that I'm wearing right now is with the Nipissing Riding Association, and me with a fantastic group of people have been putting together these ongoing conversations. So just a little nod and thank you to that group as well. So we're going to move through, get right into it. You can see me on the side, it says host. If you have questions that you have for the panel, you can directly write me, and I can see at the end if we can address some of those questions if we don't get to them, and we'll get started. So here we go. This question's for Marit, the first question. As the government is increasingly lobbied to reopen the economy, there is recognition that many workers have children. And if those workers aren't determined to be essential, they probably don't have viable childcare options at this time. Can you help us understand how the economy can operate without opening schools and childcare, and who this impacts the most?
Well, I thank you for that. I think that it's also actually in your question to an extent, like the issue we're finding, and increasingly so, is that those folks who are, essential, as we've decided, or the government has decided, are essential workers right now, a lot of those workers are women. And a lot of those workers, women or not women, have children. And so that's why the government had to come up with a plan to provide some kind of free childcare where possible for those essential workers, because it was pretty we're going to be able to get by with schools and childcare closed. And the truth is also, you know, many families, if you're fortunate enough to still be working or to have income coming in, you're working from home. So it's a very difficult balance for many people out there. But I think as we watch the government, and you've seen it over the last week, and we're expecting tomorrow, the Premier is going to come out with the latest information about what, you know, stage 1 might look like of reopening the economy and when that's going to happen. And when they start talking about doing that, the first thing I'm thinking of is, well, none of that can happen. I mean, our economic recovery is completely dependent on opening childcare and, in many cases, schools. And so until we get to a place where we're able to do that, I think we are all going to be, as a society, we're going to be dealing with the reality that the economy isn't going to be able to be up and running. And at the same time, as we have seen some outbreaks in childcare centers, even those that are open for essential workers. So we have to do this very carefully, and we have to do it in a very slow and staged way. And I think, you know, we've been urging in the NDP from the beginning that guidance has to come from the experts. It has to come from not just public health, which obviously has to guide, you know, when the right time is, when we're there, but also those frontline providers, those folks who are the childcare workers and the teachers and the education experts, because otherwise it's going to go badly wrong. And that's, I think, our fear. And I also think as parents, we have to have the confidence that our kids are going to be well and safe in those environments and benefiting from it. I also just want to quickly say, I think that we have to distinguish between opening schools and childcare. You know, if people are finding that, like, their issue right now is, I can't cope, I can't get my work done, or I need to go to a job that, you know, things are reopening, I need to get moving, and I can't focus on that because I'm dealing with my child who's homeschooling right now, or remote distance learning. If that's the issue, then, you know, it may not be that we can bring back school fully, but maybe we have to find other ways to help families and support families in that moment. And a lot of those families are also, flip side, childcare and education workers. That's a great question.
Thank you. Dr. Ferguson, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's, I would agree that absolutely women are at a disadvantage in this situation. And I've even heard the term in one news article this week called a she session. It's hard to say. Instead of a recession, it's a she session. Of course, with childcare, elder care, we still know that women do take on a lot of those tasks at home. And I think when we look to other countries, I mean, we can see what's going on. I mean, in the UK, for example, schools were never closed for essential workers. Schools have remained open. There's a lot of, I could say, about returning to school and child welfare, because, you know, we say often, like the mantra, you're not stuck at home, you're safe at home. That is not true for all children. And I think we need to be very cognizant that for some kids, home is not safe. So it is really complicated. We want our kids to go back to a very, you know, healthy and safe workplace and we, as teachers, we want our children, our education workers to also go back to healthy and safe workplaces. So it is complex, but we can't have everyone go back to work with no childcare. And what I am hearing from a lot of my friends who are essential workers is that their grandparents are looking after their children, like the grandparents. And of course, that is not what we want. And they're already extending the bubbles anyway, because, you know, my friend works at Shoppers Drug Mart. She's like, my parents have to look after my child. So, you know, so it's very complex.
Bryan, what else can you add to that question?
I don't believe I can add anything. It was answered fantastically by my two colleagues here, and I don't want to take up any time attempting to echo anything less than what they have said. They've articulated the points fantastically. Thank you.
Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Ferguson, and it kind of hops on to what we were just speaking of, so you can add a little bit more to it here. So the research that you conducted has focused on the stress and mental health of educators. Given how any widespread economic reopening will be heavily reliant upon our childcare and education systems, the health of those educators is paramount. How has your research perspective informed your experience of COVID-19? And what are the key health issues for educators coming through this experience? And how should they be best supported?
So much to say. So but one of the things I'll start with is that research has shown again and again and again that the biggest stressors for teachers are lack of administrative support and poor school culture. You know, having a school that maybe not healthy psychologically, they don't feel support from their principals, etc. And you can see how in a COVID world, those elements would have to be positive. There would have to be that element of trust, that teachers feel safe and that they're trusting their principals, Minister of Education, their school board, that it is safe to be back at work. So already there's that issue there. And of course, we know that the labor situation just before COVID, there wasn't a lot of trust. So we're already starting from not a great point. So there are cracks there. The other top stressor we know from research, from decades of research, is the classroom management piece. And of course, that's student behaviors and managing your classroom accordingly. Classroom management is usually the #1 stressor that teachers cite. So you can imagine in a COVID world where we're asking students to stay in their 2-meter square tape on the floor, like we saw in those images from Quebec, how difficult that may be. And if you have a child with behavior needs who can't even sit and listen to a story, perhaps, how difficult it would be to keep them in that square for the health and safety of themselves and their classmates. So you could see some of the classroom behaviors perhaps exacerbated because of COVID. So in terms of their own physical health, though, I do think that teachers are like other workers. They're essential workers, you know. There will be groups of teachers who cannot go back to work. And perhaps they might be the teachers who might look after some of the online learning for their students who cannot go back to work due to their being in high-risk groups too. Perhaps that's all I wanted to say about that. But it will be difficult for teachers to go back. I mean, absolutely. And I think it's a balance because at the end of the day, teachers are very caring individuals. And I've done a lot of research on the emotional labor of teaching. So not only are they worried about their own health and safety, the health and safety of their children, I think teachers are aware of the child welfare situation right now. We know calls are down to CAS. We know about increased domestic violence during COVID and the impact of isolation. So there's a lot of emotional labor that will go into teacher mental health. Even just going back, preparing to go back, it is a big task to go back.
Thank you. Marit, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was very interesting. So thanks for sharing that. I mean, I think that point that you made at the end there, Kristen, about the emotional toll that all of this is actually taking on teachers. I hear that so often. I can see Bryan is nodding his head too. I hear that so often from educators, and I've heard from so many who are finding this period really difficult. Like, I know that it's been a struggle for parents as well, and I think it's important to acknowledge that also it's the educators themselves that are finding that difficult too, in how they stress a lot about the anxiety of knowing that one kid they can't reach and connect with, or that child's not getting the support they need, and that's really tough. I did want to say, you know, as you pointed out, Kristen, like there was this kind of difficult time we've all been going through in education over the last year. A lot of friction. We had the strikes, we had threats of cuts, we had all kinds of stuff happening. And so I think there's a really big need right now from the provincial government side to be really clear, and this is something we've been pushing for and I've been pushing for in the legislature, that every resource possible has to be available. When schools do reopen, like now as well, let's be clear, because it may be like this for a while longer, but certainly, like if we're going to go back to school, and when we go back to school, however we go back to school, we teachers, families, students need to know that every resource available is going to be there for them. And that means for teachers, additional support. It means, you know, and it can mean a lot of things, but it can mean more child and youth workers and mental health supports, not just for students, certainly, because the words I'm starting to hear are trauma, that we are experiencing a collective trauma, and we will see that on the side of children, but also the staff, the educators themselves. And so you're going to need supports for all of, in many different respects. And that's why I think, even though, like we talked about, we need childcare, we need things to start moving to support that economic recovery eventually, we also need to do this very carefully. So there's that. And then there's the whole other level of the health and safety part of this. And I just want to end by saying that the number one issue that before all of this started, if I sat down with any teacher representatives, any of the unions, for example, the number one issue everybody raised was violence in classrooms. And so I think, to understand that that's something that's very real, that many of our teachers in particular, but other education workers face, that could be a really, that is an additional thing to be more concerned about now when you're coming into a situation where maybe a lot of children haven't had the kind of supports that they needed, that they normally have during this, when they're in school.
Hey, Bryan, do you have anything to add to how you think educators should be best supported coming through this?
I do have a little bit to add. As was spoken about, mental health stresses are, very, very significant. And so that was spoken to. So I won't speak about that. And the collective trauma that was quoted is very unique. And I do think, thank you for raising that as well. Now, I cannot speak from the lens of the researcher, but when schools do eventually open, I hope that myself and other educators are given the tools and support for having students back physically in the classroom. Because as the teacher of a second language, as that language teacher, I have multiple classrooms of children entering and exiting my room throughout the day. So at that point, it becomes, well, functionally on a physical level, how do I operate? How does that classroom operate? Because we could still have the distancing, but what was just used, we see the efforts taken by stores and the time it takes to wash and to clean and to prepare each and every one checkout station. Now imagine the number of seats in a classroom for me to transition to the next class coming in. And that would be very unique. And so that was my only point, is the physical space. I hope teachers are prepared for that and given the proper training.
Thank you. The next question is for you, Bryan. We know that Indigenous education systems receive less resources per student than students in public education. Historically, the funding gap between public schools and First Nations schools has hovered around 30%. While there's been an incremental improvement in terms of awareness of this problem, the historic discrimination continues, translating into fewer resources for First Nation students, everything from fewer tech to less teachers in classrooms. Can you speak about how COVID has exacerbated the challenges facing the students and families in the communities you work with? And what do you think is really important for people listening and watching to know about?
Sorry, thank you for that question. It's a very unique situation that First Nations communities are in, and not only First Nations communities, but I work as an Ojibwe language teacher in a small town, and beside that small town are two reserves, two First Nations reservations on either side of it. And so I have students from both communities enrolled in our school. And so the first thing we hear about is accessibility to internet and technology is an issue on many First Nations reserves. And that poses an issue in this COVID-19 world. But it's not just inequalities in the field of education and technology that are compounding the difficulties that we are now living with. For First Nations, there has been a housing crisis that has existed in many communities for far too long. The results in overcrowded housing for many of our people are beyond initial comprehension. There's been research, and I would say not enough research on it, because there are many dangers that occur in a world where we have overcrowded housing and a pandemic. Now, the first is the ability for students to do schoolwork. That's affected. When you live in a place of overcrowded housing, you don't have a desk or a workspace. It becomes very difficult for students to be expected to do just that, sit in a place and do work on their technology. Secondly, in a world of overcrowded housing during this time of pandemic, the risks to the families if COVID-19 were to enter their home would be disastrous. We have seen this occur with H1N1, where First Nations communities were so badly affected that people pondered if biology was a factor in the rate of spread of H1N1 among First Nations people. And it was overcrowded housing, compounded with whether or not households had reliable access to clean running water. That was the major factor. And so we see this, there's much more to consider before we even look at whether or not a student and a laptop and an internet are even available. Another challenge we need to acknowledge is that the last residential school closed in Canada in 1997. I was 6 years old. Was 1997 even a generation ago? So we have this scar on our history that has not only affected some First Nations people in their ability to parent, but now they have an expectation to become the educator to their child. So how did residential schooling affect people in becoming a teacher? How comfortable are First Nations families with the placement of the provincial education institution into their own homes? That's a difficult thing, and I don't have an answer. But one thing I would really like people to know, to take out of this, is the value of land-based learning. For always, First Nations people have strongly valued land-based learning. And I see many people, including myself, taking their children out onto the land and learning. Learning on the land can happen with both contemporary modern knowledge as well as traditional knowledge. And traditionally, First Nations people had mathematics, we had geography, we had mapping, we have a very complex language structure. So those are a few of the weights that are placed upon First Nations communities, not only on the reservation itself, but for urban First Nation people as well. And I would even say that in urban First Nations for urban First Nations people, we see in our communities, we are more prone to be working in precarious conditions because of the lower levels of education among First Nations Canadians. And we are doing more frontline service work than the general population. I would propose that. I have not Googled that, in fact, but I would say we seen on the news the types of work First Nations people are doing that COVID affected. Right away was the cigarette stores and the big long lineups and the exposure. And so for urban First Nations people, not only do they have all those other effects, but precarious working conditions as well. And I'll stop talking there.
Yeah, thank you for explaining the unbelievable complexities to that question. I know that I definitely gave you a big one to consider answering, so thank you. Dr. Ferguson, can you add to that?
I think Bryan summed it up very nicely, but I think what COVID has done has really just shone a light on all these, you know, the cracks that we have and things that have not been addressed by governments for decades about First Nations people, whether it be drinking water, housing, etc. So I think it just really it exacerbates a problem we already have that we needed to fix so long ago. So thank you, Bryan, for summing that up.
Yeah, if I may, I thought that was really interesting, and I appreciated those comments, Bryan. And I don't have a lot to add except to say that and to echo what Kristen just said, it really has like shone a light, COVID. I mean, I was talking about this recently with some other folks, that it's shining a light on the inequities that exist already. And, you know, when I think of the number of times that our MPPs, particularly in the North, but, you know, all across Ontario, have raised these issues of lack of access to technology and internet and as well as housing and schools in First Nations communities, and how often that just seems to like land with nothing from government after government after government. It's so frustrating, and I don't necessarily, I'm not naive enough to think that these things, instantly change by any means, but I do hope that if any good can come out of this terrible tragedy that's hitting us as a province, it's that perhaps we can actually get our heads around the fact that not everybody's home life or experience is the same, that not everybody lives in the same place and confronts the same challenges, that there are many different kinds of challenges. And I thought your point about the also taking into account the impact of residential school experience on, people's interaction with learning is really important. And then, just also to say that, there have been, attempts by previous governments to try to have, Indigenous partners at the table in a really real way when we talk about how we engage in talking about like curriculum and how we work in schools, and also to take some of that benefit and bring it into the experience that all children have. Like, as you talked about the value of land-based learning. But I think I feel like we've taken a real step back in the last few years. It's been very unfortunate. So maybe this will be an opportunity, and certainly, let's try to find those few little bright lights where we could actually try to move things forward and make real change.
Thank you. I'm sure that we could have a whole conversation just on that question itself. So the next one, Marit, it's for you. Elementary, secondary, and post-secondary pivoted relatively quickly to start delivering learning online when this pandemic struck. Talks are currently underway to determine what school will look like for our students and adult learners come fall. Many workers in this sector are worried about their risk to exposure if schools and campuses were to resume. We have educators working in close proximity to dozens of students. We have techs and labs and cleaning and cafeteria work all in close quarters. We did touch on this a little bit, but if you have anything to add, what concerns do you have of the health and safety of this workforce as the economy faces increased financial pressure to reopen? Particularly while there's a government in power that, in our opinion, has not felt compelled to extend support to education.
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I like I said, we did mention a few of these things, but I actually think so first of all, what are the actual concerns around health and safety of the workforce? And I think, there's the obvious or maybe obvious stuff like personal protective equipment, PPE, that we're seeing is in short supply everywhere, even on the front line in the long-term care residences and in some hospitals. So I know that's something that people are very concerned about. I had a doctor, actually, a family physician, who was coming to talk to me about, of course, issues that family physicians, and of course we have a shortage of family physicians in many parts of this province, but them talking about even, their inability to access that equipment, gloves, gowns, masks, etc., sanitizer, cleaning supplies. These are like just the most immediate, obvious things, but they're very significant, because if you can't provide those things now where they're really needed, you certainly aren't prepared to provide those to a whole other sector, which is massive. So there's that. I mean, the other piece is space. And I think that, depending on where you are in the province and what community you're living in, your school may be either in disrepair. We know that there's a huge capital repair backlog for schools. So we have a lot of schools, all across the province. Let's also talk about specifically in First Nations communities where you may not have clean water, where we have other disrepair issues, a lack of space, a lack of safe space. Bryan mentioned a really real issue, which is how do you set it up so that you actually are not exposing everybody, and you're doing the necessary like infection control in between. So there's all those logistical things, and frankly, we're going to be looking at what's going on in other parts of the world where I think things are going, maybe some are going right, some are going wrong, but what really so all of those things are reason enough to be concerned about how quickly we move. Whatever we do, because we already talked about the mental health issues, the trauma, the preparedness of teachers. Like, people are worried about this. Like, how prepared am I? Have I been trained properly to deal with these things? Have I had the professional development? What do I do? What even does that look like to transition my class back into school when they're all dealing with this, what supports will be there? If we're not taking the time to prepare properly for this, it's going to go badly wrong. That's my fear as a parent, as an MPP. That's my fear. And I think that's the fear of a lot of families. And if you look at what's happening in Quebec, where people may know that they are starting in parts of Quebec to open up schools, it's going to be that people are not sending their kids to school because they don't feel like it's safe. And I worry actually a little bit that the government is kind of taking that, thinking, well, if we open them, well, not everybody's going to come back anyways. And that's also an issue because who's forced to make that choice? It's the families who have no choice. It's the worker who has to go to work because their employer won't, isn't gonna pay them, if they don't go to work, And so again, like this is forcing families into making impossible choices. So I think there's that. I also did want to say, I think your point about financial pressure, there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about directions that governments take. It's a whole other conversation about what directions governments take when they've been faced with recession and situations like this. Is something we haven't obviously seen in generations. But in the past, when we've hit bad times, some governments choose austerity, which means they choose cuts. And already we're hearing that the government is looking at, well, maybe school boards have some savings from not running full programs right now. So use those savings. And I think like we need to know, and school boards need to know now that they have all the resources they're going to need to go into this, to do it in the most careful way, because people are really have reason to be concerned. And teachers are workers, education workers are workers, and they deserve the same health and safety protections as anybody else. And of course, their health and safety is our children's health and safety.
Thank you. Dr. Ferguson, you kind of have a multi-layer approach with this because you're also teaching educators as well. Anyway, I just wanted to see if you had anything else to add to that topic.
I do, and it's more of a local issue, but it's the local riding. I have to think it's such an ironic time to be closing high schools when we need space. So I think the question of how many mothballed schools are out there in the province, is there funding to possibly open up those schools to have, we have a whole additional high school that will be vacant. If we need to spread out, now is the time to spread out. So there are a lot of local questions I think we could all ask of our school boards and the ministry about looking at some of these mothballed buildings.
Bryan, do you have anything to add?
No, I couldn't add anything else to what was already well spoken. If I'm at an opera, I don't choose to sing, and she just sung very well, so I wouldn't sing after something was spoken so very well. So no, I don't want to add anything to that.
See, you can tell that Bryan's not a, I was going to say Bryan's not a politician. Like he doesn't feel like he has to respond to everything. I love
it. You're right. Well, you're not off the hook, Bryan, so you can unmute your mic because I got the next ones for you. So COVID has been a new experience and challenging experience for so many people. Can you share any wisdom, advice, or teachings that have helped you personally in the way that you are processing the events of this pandemic?
Well, when this came to fruition and we first started hearing the rumblings of what it means to have a pandemic in our communities, and the words social isolation started coming out, I did what I was taught by my greatest teachers of all, and I looked out the window of my home into my backyard. And if you are willing to close your eyes for a second with me, and just my backyard goes, there's grass and then there's a river right there. And when I look in my backyard, when it was announced in the end of March or mid-March, there's geese there. And those geese come and they have their babies every year in my home. And so I was thinking there and I was wondering, well, what does it mean? What is coming of this world? And I watched these geese. Now, when we think of geese, we think of animals that fly together in great groups. and they graze on those park lawns in big groups, and we say, oh, get out of there, you're ruining the lawns in your great groups. But the truth is, in mid-March and in April, when the geese were here, if you noticed, they weren't in groups. They were just starting to find nesting grounds to raise their little babies. And they become territorial to one another. They maintain distance in their families from one another while their babies are still young, so that they can spend time with their little ones. And even though they are eating and grazing in the same field, and even though they're going to the same river in front of my house and swimming in the same water, these geese maintained a distance from one another. And I know that it's not forever. I know that these geese are going to bunch up and go over to the soccer field down the river and tear up the lawn over there in one big group. And then they're going to go fly away in a group eventually. And so we too need some time to act like geese. We need to spend time with our family. We can still go to that river and go to that field, but we got to maintain that same social distance that those other geese are. And pretty soon, us too will be allowed to flock and honk with each other. And so that's what I say. And maybe the teaching is that we can go honk around later, or maybe the teaching is that we just need to spend some time looking out the window.
Thank you. Dr. Ferguson, how have you been managing this challenging situation?
Managing as a parent and managing work, as we all know, is extremely difficult, and trying to find a balance. And when your kid has a Zoom meeting, it's almost like you have a Zoom meeting too, and it is absolutely a challenge. So well, I think we're going to talk about e-learning a little bit later, so maybe I'll hold that thought.
Marit, what are you learning throughout this? How are you keeping?
Well, I mean, I think, it's been ups and downs. If we're honest, I think we all know, like, there's good days and there's days that are really hard. And I think, like, as a parent of teenagers, I feel like I know all children at all levels, and most adults are having a tough time in one way or another. And for teenagers, I really feel like it's that social piece that's gone. It's so incredibly difficult for them to be physically distanced from their friends. And even though we always think of that generation using all kinds of technology if they can access it and, relying on these things, the truth is that it doesn't replicate that proximity, like that actual human contact. And I think my daughter, in particular, the one in high school, was really missing that time with her friends. But what's been interesting for me is, like, as a working parent, is even though I find it is hard to manage that, and I only have the one to really oversee, I should say, like, I'm not dealing with 3 small children right now, thank goodness, because that would be really hard. So for all of you who are, that's a huge task. But what I find is, like, I'm actually trying to find some joy in the moments and that are really special. Like, the truth is, we don't sit down and have dinner together that often anymore, and we don't have those opportunities. So trying to, like, think this is only, this may go on for a while, but it really is only a fleeting moment. So that's helped me a lot. But also, and the other thing is just, I think like a lot of people, when I talk to people in my community, like, if there's not an issue that they're dealing with, even if they are dealing with some issue, the next question is always, how can I help? How can I help others? I feel very privileged in my position to be able to actually provide support to people somehow, and guidance or navigate issues. And I find that actually is pretty comforting. Like, I think it is for a lot of us, right? Like, to know that you can, whether it's, helping deliver food or helping out a neighbor or whatever it is, that can be also really helps a lot.
Thank you. I asked that question because sometimes it's, it's interesting to see where people are leaning on how they're supporting each other and what they're doing to get through this, and any learning that is coming out of it. So I will move on to the e-learning question, Dr. Ferguson, if you don't mind. So before COVID-19, the government was negotiating with unions for mandatory e-learning in our public education system. And we recently saw increased direction to boards and teachers from the minister to implement more synchronous live e-learning. What have we learned about online learning during this period? What are its strengths, limitations, and how have your concerns shifted or become clearer over the course of COVID?
Wow, what a question. So I think like any parent, we all have so much to say about e-learning. And Bryan touched a little bit on already about the access issue. And of course, that was our immediate concern when this all came out. And I mentioned to Erika before, I know like Redbridge, Ontario, 15 minutes from here doesn't have cell phone service. So this idea that, you know, everyone just has access is just nonsense. Of course, we're remote areas. And then the hardware issues about distributing tech. There's just not enough to go around. And ongoing issues with data and usage. And the idea of parents in the GTA being told to drive to school to use the Wi-Fi and sit in the parking lot, I think is preposterous. But, you know, they were told that. So there's, of course, the tech issues. But the actual learning itself, you know, and we're calling it now emergency remote teaching, which is a good name, I think. It's not real e-learning. Like actual e-learning is designed pedagogically to suit the online environment. This is not what we're doing here. And we really shifted quickly to a new world. And I know as a parent, I have 3 kids. I think there's like 8 teachers amongst those 3 kids when you put science, social studies and all that in there. And it is very teacher dependent. You know, some teachers are doing more worksheet based. Some are doing more, you know, Teams, Zoom, Collaborate. Others are, you know, assigning Dreambox exclusively for math, and that is math now, is Dreambox. So, and it also feels like there's a bazillion platforms, whether it be Edsby, Clever, Office 365, check this, post to this. It's quite showing how we are technologically savvy, but yet very clunky at the same time. So, you know, as we would expect, I think we are seeing the older kids adapting somewhat better to online learning. You know, my 8-year-olds, I have 8-year-old twins. They can't just whip out Microsoft Word and type up their paragraph and save it and submit it to their teacher. They need an awful lot of help. So it becomes a burden for me. It becomes my job too. You know, us who are working from home and who have other jobs, you know, and I try to juggle my own Zoom meeting with my child's Zoom meeting. He had a Teams meeting yesterday. So I ended up doing work on the evenings and weekends. But I think I'd also like to acknowledge too about the older kids here. And I have several friends who are high school teachers. And I think we have to acknowledge that for many teenagers, they themselves are essential workers. These part-time jobs those kids have been doing have turned into full-time jobs. And some kids are working 60+ hours a week. Some of these teenagers are now the primary, breadwinner for their family because their parents have been laid off. Older workers may be high risk. And so really we have looked for these teenagers to fill this huge workplace gap. So how are those teenagers working 60+ hours a week supposed to do synchronous learning? It's really, when you sit and think about it, it's really difficult. And my high school teacher friends are talking about this to me quite a bit. They need time to complete their work too. So getting into synchronous versus asynchronous, very strong feelings about this. I mean, we've been doing online learning at the university level for a long time in higher education. And we very, very rarely, very seldom use synchronous learning because we know there are barriers. There's good reasons to not use it. People can't log in at the same time. There may be childcare. There may be limited devices. The list just goes on. So simply put, I just think it could be a disaster to mandate this. And I was almost expecting that announcement today, some kind of enhanced synchronous learning. And I was kind of pleased that it didn't come. But I can tell you the day that my kid has his Teams meeting, his weekly meeting, is one of my most stressful mornings of the entire week. And I can also go on ad nauseum about the potential ramifications for teachers in terms of doing synchronous learning with children. I mean, the minister actually said something about, he said small group and one-on-one. Is a male grade 8 teacher really going to have one-on-one conversations with 13-year-old girls? It's absurd. It's just simply absurd from a worker perspective. So I could go on, but I'm welcome to open up dialogue to my colleagues there about their experiences with e-learning.
Bryan?
So Thank you so much for sharing. A lot of those difficulties do exist now in the school I teach in. We're a small K-8 school, so firstly, the ability to learn over a digital format requires that the students be able to know how to, read, communicate effectively using a keyboard, and to troubleshoot the electronics they're using. And so immediately, right, there's a huge barrier right off the bat that exists with young students, and having to learn a topic as well as learning how to use technology effectively, well, that becomes quite a large task. Now, patience is the key to every goal we will achieve. Patience is the strongest tool you could ever hold. Now, patience with technology, oh dear, like I have patience with quite a few things, but technology patience, and then we expect how many families across Ontario to host patience in their life and learn new patience for technology? That's asking for quite a lot to continue to do. And so this is before even mentioning the difficulties of online learning with anybody who has an intellectual or learning disability or physical disability that interferes with that ability to learn. This is just talking about those neuronormal, neurotypical people and physical typical people before we even speak to all of the other issues that may exist. So there's quite a few barriers on the road to a keyboard. And personally, I think of e-learning as a skill set that needs to be developed. Much alike Dr. Ferguson said, it's with the older students. So learning to be able to learn on electronics is a very long concept to grasp, to use the digital tools as a context, and to have very little as a physical representation in front of them. Some people learn best with their hands, some through music and poetry, some through repetition, some through questions, some through listening to stories. But for a digital format to suddenly be used, that is a very difficult limitation. And I'll end it there.
Marit?
Well, I don't have a lot to add. I mean, I always defer to the experts, the educators on this one. I mean, that they said it all so well. I mean, I would just add that when the government was proposing these mandatory online courses, which they're going to do, they're going to introduce 2. If we were in back to normal school, there would be 2 mandatory online courses expected for high school students. And I would just say, if there are definitely lessons out of this moment, and the government may want to say, well, look, we have to, and I agree with Bryan too, like we do. We have to figure out, we have to invest in this. We have to learn how to use these tools. For one thing, we may be facing this reality for some time on and off, right? Like, unfortunately. But also, we know that especially in some remote communities, and again, taking into account there's right now huge barriers in technology and Wi-Fi, et cetera. But if we're going to give, for example, a student in a more remote community the access to, additional courses and opportunities, which online learning can provide, that requires additional resources. Like, it's not, and this government looks at it like it's a savings thing. I mean, that's why they were doing it. It's about savings. But, if you're doing it right, there aren't savings. You're investing in it. You're making sure there's more resources put into that learning to access, but also to, actually the quality of the experience. So there's maybe fewer students and more teachers. And so it has to be done properly and well. And that doesn't mean, and I think that's not where this government was actually unfortunately headed with it. So I would hope that they take a step back now and listen to what the experts, the front line, the educators are telling them, and parents too.
Just to follow up, e-learning is not an inexpensive endeavor. And at a university, we can tell you that our online classes are generally half the size of our in-person classes. They are so much more work. in terms of instruction. And what we are doing now is not real e-learning. Like, it's emergency remote teaching, and I think we have to keep that in mind.
I think I'm going to move to a question. I know that for some of the panelists, I am bopping around a little bit on the question page, but I think if you don't mind, Marit, I'm going to move to you here. And I want to talk about, government accountability. So it sure seems that you're tasked with continually keeping the current government accountable by correcting the record on government announcements. I recently thinking of the free iPads to low-income students in reference as an example. In an age where misinformation is increasingly harnessed online and the cutbacks to news media are ever apparent, the role of an opposition critic is so important. Can you share a little bit about how you approach your role, expecting that government will continue to make announcements and false claims like this without repercussions, or the need to recant incorrect public information? It just feels that he's already spoken to his base and, it's so hard to keep that all accountable. So I'm really curious to know how you handle that.
Yeah, it's an interesting example because when the minister came out with that announcement, he if you read the news release that government issued and you read it really carefully, in like the smallest print, you could see that what they were talking about was not that they had purchased all kinds of new iPads to distribute around the province, or that they purchased, Wi-Fi enabled devices. If you read the small print, what they were saying was, oh yeah, there's a lot of these happening and it's a good thing. But the way it came out in the press conference, and it was entirely intentional by the minister, was they made it sound like, yeah, we're giving out all these devices and we're doing all these great things. And the interesting thing about that is I don't think I would have caught on to that if I hadn't been talking pretty regularly to school boards and to education workers and trustees and all of those folks that are actually doing this work. And I was hearing from school boards, about how much work was going into it and the tough decisions they were having to make, and how some school boards just, couldn't possibly get the devices to students. And even if they did, there might not be Wi-Fi. And so all these tough calls that were being made. And that where it was being distributed, it was coming from schools. So these were actually devices that already existed that school boards were just distributing. So like a totally good example of like complete misinformation by this government. I could not actually, if the legislature was in session, I could not stand up in the legislature and say, Minister, you're lying, because that would be considered unparliamentary and I would get kicked out. But I could say it here. They misled Ontarians, and they're doing it quite often. And it's very unfortunate because in this moment, I have to say, I think everybody is really trying hard to believe the best in each other, right? And to just have hope. And I do believe that, I certainly don't think that government, that they're all out to make life difficult I think there's a real crisis that they are actually trying to solve. We all know that, like there are lives at risk. But to use these moments to exploit for political purposes is, I think, exactly what people don't want to see. So for me, in terms of how we maintain that accountability, it's actually sharing information. And you've got to go right to the people who are living it, right to the teachers and the school boards and the students themselves. And like this conversation, I've learned a lot here today that I will take back with me too. And the next time the minister's putting forward some, talking about something in a certain way, saying, oh, this and this and this is working really well, I'm going to say, well, actually, I heard from teachers who said no, a professor who said no, and it'll make a big difference. And I just also want to, the other thing I wanted to mention was, while we're in a bit of a delicate moment for those of us who are like advocates or activists or in opposition, or, we also need to remember that is our role, that it's okay to advocate, that it's important to speak up, that the issues that are being faced, that your issues as a parent who's struggling, that's really important. And we should be able to talk about that. It doesn't get pushed aside. And I think that's just, so that's what I was going to say. I think it's very important to continue to hold government to account. That's, and it's good for them because it makes good government. You see that every day. If the federal level if I have to say, and I mean, obviously I'm a partisan, but I think that if Jagmeet Singh and the NDP federally had not been raising issues with the gaps in the kinds of supports that the federal government is giving, and there's lots happening, it's very exciting. But if that had not happened, if they were not raising those issues, those gaps would not be addressed. You have to have an opposition that's willing to speak strongly and not be shy about raising those issues.
Thank you. So my next question is for Bryan. On the role of the teacher. So the role of a teacher isn't always well understood, but many times it extends beyond simply delivering information in front of the classroom, or most recently in front of a laptop. Teachers form trusting relationships with students and are often a critical bridge between families in crisis and more specialized helping resources. COVID-19 has created more distance between students and teachers, and we very well may not know the full extent of the hardship facing students and families until face-to-face instruction resumes. Bryan, can you speak to how you view the role of a teacher now and the critical role many teachers play due to lack of appropriate support?
Thank you. It's unique, how I view the role of a teacher now and the critical role many teachers play due to the lack of appropriate supports. It's so unique because we need to first look at what kind of supports were available in the school. What are we currently missing? And in a small town school, there are countless supports that I've seen my students receive that may no longer be servicing those children. We very simply, to start off the day, you see a breakfast club, we see a food service, and then throughout the day there are support services, there is specialized speech services, there is counseling. There are so many unique things that come in the community that a school provides throughout the day, that when this pandemic hit and the role of a teacher in facilitating those transitions to those support services in a school, are students still receiving speech therapy for those who need it? Are they receiving support services, counseling? Is the breakfast club being extended? Now, I do know that in the position I am in and with my colleagues, many of us are maintaining great contact with the families still. And because of that, we have been able to assist families in some of those ways, in the ways of food security. And for some families that are inquiring about counseling services, I know that the local First Nations beside my school are providing those counseling services. And I have ensured any parents that I've spoken with myself that there are available services that can be met. Now, the critical role teachers play is so unique because there was just that sense of that daily routine, that welcome face, that learning place. And so we've lost that, unfortunately. But hopefully, through great communication, we are maintaining some level of support services that were existing in the school onto many of the students in the local communities. It's a very big question and very difficult to pinpoint the critical roles of teachers because we're so spread out in the world. So at this moment, I believe the greatest role teachers play is the role of a valuable communicator. And as long as that communication continues flowing between the teacher, the family, the student, and the school, services can be provided if they're known and if they're available to the families.
Dr. Ferguson?
Yeah, thank you, Bryan. And I think you brought up so many good points. And I think, you know, we cannot neglect the idea of children's mental health in all of this. And I think you brought up some really good points there. And I have 3 kids, and one of mine is handling it, you know, he's introverted, doesn't care. The other one's kind of, she has good days, bad days, and the other one's having a very tough time. He's very social. And he does cry, especially the last week. He's been crying a lot, and he's fully well aware that children in Nipissing, Quebec get to go back to school this week, and he's very upset about it. And I think when we think about the letter that Quebec pediatricians did write in support of schools, we have to acknowledge that there are some very, very good arguments to be made about why school is so important to the welfare state. And those physical connections are very important. So personally, I am torn between, you know, the kids returning to school, especially those at high risk, and the teachers at high risk. But I think that personal connection with schools is so important. So I think we do have to have a balance in that, in our thinking about return to school too. It can be incredibly valuable for young kids and older children.
All right.
Well, I don't have a lot to add. I thought that was wonderfully put. But I do think that if I mean, when you ask what is the most important role of a teacher, I would just go back to, what have we learned? What are we as parents? What are we as society learning in this moment? And one of the greatest lessons I keep hearing from parents is, wow, I appreciate so much the role of the teacher. I had, and it's not just as simple as I appreciate how much work goes into this, because I'm not a teacher and I'm not there, but, every day, but it's also seeing that connection that your child has, which is kind of interesting, because for the most part, by the time they're in junior kindergarten already, you're just like, they're gone. They come home. Maybe you have a little interaction with the homework. Some parents have a different, more interaction with schools than others, but for a lot of us, we don't. And so I think it's really made it more apparent, I hope, to a lot of families, a lot of Ontarians, about why and how important and crucial the role of teachers is. And public education too, and the role of public education.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then if anyone in the participants watching right now have any questions, we can see what we can take in the chat box. I know we're over time, so thank you very much for staying. I think it's a good conversation to stay a little bit longer for. So the last question, Dr. Ferguson, is for you. The pace of change in education during this pandemic has been really rapid. I can imagine what we've witnessed has created a lot of stress for students, for families, and for educators. As someone who trains educators, what are your priorities now in terms of preparing learners for teaching in this new world and the supports that educators require and may require in the future?
Yeah, so the timing of COVID was very interesting for me professionally, because at Nipissing, we had just implemented a change in mandatory courses. We have one of the very few universities to have a mandatory technology-enhanced learning course. And we had just swapped it out maybe a month before for a course on classroom management, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the #1 stressor of teachers. So we had just swapped that out. And of course, this was done in consultation with students, alumni, etc. But, the issue we see with preparing teachers and teacher training is that a course in technology and education that you took 5 years ago in your BEd could be very much out of date 3-4 years later. Of course, the educational technology theories would still apply, but any software, apps, and those types of things that you may have learned would probably have changed. But I think what COVID has made very clear is that the teachers who were more tech savvy in the first place had a smoother transition. I watched my own spouse take part in 2 weeks of PD training offered by the board, trying to train teachers very quickly online through Zoom on all these different platforms. And if you were already using something like EDSB before COVID, obviously the shift to online was easier in a way for the students and for teachers. So having that level of tech savvy is important. And we saw this at the university. I mean, our, you know, as an institution, we already have a platform. We have Blackboard. So when we went online, all the courses already have Blackboard shells. Students generally use them. Most professors, I would say, use them. So it was quite, we still had challenges, but we weren't in the same kind of way, I guess, as elementary and secondary school teachers. So we'll, you know, when we go back to face-to-face meetings, I imagine we will have conversations about that tech course. Should we bring it back? Because I know we were one of the very few universities in the provinces that had it. The other thing too, is what we saw is we had to cancel our last student teacher placement. Some school boards said, sorry, we don't want your student teachers. Other school boards were like, please send us your student teachers. We need the tech help. Our teachers could really use this, right? We could buddy them up. Our associate teachers, you know, could be mentored by some of the students who are very tech savvy, but it wasn't consistent across the board. So our office had to make the very difficult decision to cancel placement. Not to worry for our students, though, we have had labor actions in the past. You know, when I was, for example, a student teacher, we had a CUPE strike. The custodians were on strike, so I missed several weeks of placement too. So missing placement is not something that's we're unaccustomed to in faculties of ed. But the big point I wanted to raise when I thought about this question is that we need in teacher education programs to do a much better job on mental health and the mental health piece. And a huge, huge part of that is the new health curriculum, which I will say that I do believe the new curriculum does a very good job addressing mental health that was not in there before. But in faculties of education, you know, we do have an optional course on student mental health, but we also need to think about teacher mental health in there. That is not in there. And I was also really disappointed when the Minister of Education put out his framework, you know, 5 hours a week in the following subjects. That health was not on there. We have mental health curriculum expectations. We have about getting outside and getting active. Those are the things that we all need to be doing during this pandemic, is looking after our mental and physical health. And we didn't include that. And so I personally find that just absolutely tragic. And we know, you know, calls to kids' help phone have greatly increased. My friends who are high school teachers talk about addiction issues of their teenagers, their teenage students, that is just being exacerbated by COVID, by being at home so much and have nothing to do. So the mental health not being included in that emergency remote teaching plan is a huge, huge mistake in my opinion. And it's something we also need to do better at in our faculties of education as well.
Bryan or Marit, do you have anything to add? That was really great, Dr. Ferguson. That just opened up my eyes to quite a bit there. Bryan, do you have anything to add to that? No? Okay. Marit?
Well, it was really, really interesting. Thank you for that. I mean, the only thing that I have on my mind a lot lately is something that, you know, keeps coming up among the teachers that I'm talking to, which is just the ongoing professional development piece. That I know that a lot of people feel like they've been kind of left out there, kind of hanging. And so, you know, this is just another reminder, as you, I mean, I can't possibly put it as well, and you would have much more insight into this, but the need to have that constant and to actually allow for the time and the investment in that for teachers, to have that ongoing learning, which for teachers, as I know, so important and critical, and teachers value it so much, but to actually include some of these issues and that. And I hadn't really thought so much about the mental health piece of the current curriculum that's being focused on right now. It's a really good point. I do think it's been just generally very disappointing because, you know, I think that what I worry about, and I was talking today to some other academics in education who were saying, you know, we've come a long way in our understanding of what is learning and what we should be learning and what we need to be focusing on in terms of future skills. And that this seems like, unfortunately, it's been an opportunity for some, and you know, maybe it won't be permanent, but to move us back to kind of reading, writing, and arithmetic, and away from the kind of deep learning and all of that knowledge that we have that has been integrated into curriculum over the years. And, you know, to be really conscious of not, you know, allowing, because I know that there is, you know, there's changes coming to curriculum under this government anyways, for the math curriculum, for example, a lot of debate happening around that. And I just would hate that this to be seen as like an opportunity to take us so far backwards when we actually have so much more we could be doing and learning. So that's my only comment.
Thank you. I'm sure that we could keep going with this. However, we're gonna end here. Just wanted to thank the panelists for their time. That was fantastic. Really appreciate. I know that this is a busy time for a lot of people, and you put a lot of energy towards this, and I just really want to thank you for that sincerely. And Marit, just want to hop onto what you said there is, you know, it's okay to be an advocate and it's okay to speak up and it's okay to become involved. And, you know, that's what our Riding Association is doing right now. And we welcome you to join us. We're a pretty good group of people. So, you know, come on over. And other than that, that's all I've got for tonight. Thank you again, Miigwech. Thank you. And enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody. I'll have this online on the YouTube channel and we'll be able to share it from there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was really great. I learned a lot too.
I'll just wait and let people trickle out. And then if you guys have any feedback for me, I'd be welcome it.